The moment I saw the notification on his phone, my world collapsed. It wasn't even my intention to snoop. I had simply picked up his phone to move it off the kitchen counter, where it buzzed incessantly. My eyes landed on the message preview before I could stop myself. Looking forward to tonight. Can't wait to finally meet you. At first, I felt frozen in place, my mind struggling to process what I was reading. My husband, Eric, was sitting in the living room, casually scrolling through the news on his laptop. The man I'd spent the last 15 years with. The man I thought I knew better than anyone else. The man who kissed me goodnight and reassured me of his love with every embrace. The heat rose in my chest, and before I knew it, I was in our bedroom, phone in hand, trembling as I unlocked it using the password I'd memorized out of sheer habit. The app was right there, a dating app bold and shameless on his home screen. My stomach churned as I opened it, scrolling through the messages, the profiles, the women. So many women. It was all there. Flirty exchanges, suggestive messages, and detailed plans for secret meetups. The timestamps revealed this wasn't some brief lapse in judgment. It had been going on for months, maybe even years. Eric wasn't just cheating on me. He had built a second life, meticulously hidden from the one we shared. By the time I snapped the phone shut, tears streaked my face, and my breaths came in shallow gasps. I wanted to storm into the living room, throw his betrayal in his face, demand to know how he could do this to me, to us. But something stopped me. Maybe it was shock. Maybe it was fear. Or maybe it was the cruel, gnawing curiosity to understand how someone who professed to love me could so deliberately destroy me. Instead, I planned. I created a fake profile on the app that same night, using a photo of a woman I found on a stock image site. I gave her a name, Clara, and filled out her profile with just the right amount of intrigue. I knew what Eric liked. I'd spent years learning his tastes. Within an hour, my profile had a message from him. "You're stunning. I'd love to take you out sometime." My stomach churned as I read his words, the ones I used to believe were only for me. Over the next few days, I played along. I messaged him back, careful to craft my responses in a way that would intrigue him without raising suspicion. He opened up quickly, sharing his frustrations about his marriage, our marriage. "My wife and I have grown apart. She doesn't understand me the way I need to be understood." The audacity made my blood boil. He was blaming me for his infidelity, painting himself as some neglected husband instead of the deceitful man I now saw him as. Finally, after a week of messages, he asked to meet in person. I agreed, setting the time and place. A cozy little wine bar downtown. The same bar we used to visit on date nights before life got busy, and we drifted into routines that apparently weren't enough for him. The evening of the meeting, I dressed carefully. I chose a dress he hadn't seen in years, styled my hair differently, and applied my makeup with precision. When I looked in the mirror, I barely recognized myself. It was as if I had become Clara. Not the devoted wife Eric had betrayed, but a stranger who held all the power in this game we were now playing. I arrived at the bar a few minutes early and chose a secluded table near the back. The dim lighting gave the space an air of intimacy, though my heart raced with a mix of nerves and fury. When Eric walked in, my breath caught in my throat. He looked nervous but excited, scanning the room until his eyes landed on me. For a moment, he froze, confusion flickering across his face before realization set in. His excitement drained, replaced by a mix of panic and something I couldn't quite place. Was it shame? "Clara," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper as he approached the table. I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Surprise," I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. "Or should I say, Eric? What name were you planning to use tonight?" He sank into the chair across from me, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly as they rested on the table. For a long moment we just stared at each other, the air between us thick with tension. "What are you doing here?" he finally asked, his voice hoarse. "I could ask you the same thing," I shot back. "But I think I already know the answer. So why don't we skip the lies and get straight to the truth? Why, Eric? Why did you do this?" He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice cracking. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this. He paused, searching for the right words. "I felt invisible, like we were just going through the motions. I didn't think you'd care." His words cut deeper than I expected. "You didn't think I'd care?" After 15 years of marriage? After everything we've built together? My voice rose, drawing a few curious glances from nearby tables, but I didn't care. You didn't think I'd care that my husband was out meeting other women while I sat at home, trusting you? Tears glistened in his eyes, and for a fleeting moment, I saw the man I had fallen in love with, the one who used to make me laugh until my sides hurt, who held me through my darkest moments. I didn't know how to talk to you, he said quietly. I felt like I'd lost you, and I didn't know how to get you back. His confession caught me off guard. I had expected excuses, denials, anger. But this raw vulnerability, it was disarming and maddening, because for all his pain and confusion, he had still chosen the coward's path, hurting me in ways I wasn't sure I could ever forgive. Do you even love me? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked at me, his eyes filled with anguish. Yes. God, yes. I never stopped. But I didn't think I was enough for you anymore. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to scream at him, to storm out and leave him to wallow in the mess he'd made. But another part of me, the part that still loved him despite everything, wanted to understand, to fix what was broken if it could be fixed. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of tears, accusations, and painful honesty. By the time we left the bar, I didn't have all the answers. I didn't know if our marriage could survive this betrayal. But for the first time in years, we had stopped pretending. We had stripped away the masks and the lies and faced each other as we truly were. Flawed, broken, and desperate for something real. Only time would tell if that was enough. The days that followed our confrontation at the wine bar were a blur of conflicted emotions. I oscillated between rage and sorrow, disbelief and hope. Eric moved through the house like a shadow, his usual confidence replaced with an almost desperate quiet. He barely spoke unless I initiated, and when he did, his words were soft, careful, as though he feared saying the wrong thing would shatter what little remained of us. I wasn't ready to forgive him. Not yet, maybe not ever, but I also couldn't bring myself to end it. 15 years wasn't something you walked away from overnight, no matter how deep the betrayal ran. So we existed in this tense limbo, dancing around each other, neither of us sure how to take the first real step forward. One night, about a week after the confrontation, I sat alone in the living room. The house was dark except for the soft glow of the lamp beside me. Eric was in the study, where he'd been spending most of his evenings since everything came to light. I stared at the divorce lawyer's number on my phone, my thumb hovering over the call button. But instead of dialing, I found myself scrolling through the dating app again. His account was still active, though it hadn't been updated since our meeting. The messages with the other women were still there. A catalog of every lie, every betrayal. I read through them until I couldn't anymore, my stomach twisting with nausea. It wasn't just the words that hurt. It was how easily they seemed to flow from him, how natural it had become for him to deceive me. And yet I noticed something else too. Among the flirtation and casual lies, there was a thread of sadness, a vulnerability he hadn't shown me in years. He talked about feeling lonely, disconnected, like he didn't know who he was anymore. It didn't excuse what he'd done, nothing ever could, but it made me realize something painful. We had both been lost in this marriage for a long time. I closed the app and set my phone aside, my thoughts swirling. I didn't want to admit it, but there was truth in what he'd said at the bar. Somewhere along the way, we had stopped seeing each other. We were so busy being partners, parents, providers that we forgot how to be us. And in that void, he had made the worst choice imaginable. The sound of footsteps broke my reverie. I looked up to see Eric standing in the doorway, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He looked hesitant, almost scared, like he wasn't sure if he was welcome. "Can I sit?" he asked softly. I nodded, and he sank into the armchair across from me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was heavy but not uncomfortable, like we were both waiting for the other to make the first move. Finally, he broke the silence. "I deleted the app," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I looked at him, surprised. "Why?" "Because I don't want it anymore," he said. "I don't want any of it. I just want to fix this. If there's even a chance I can." His words hung in the air, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. "Do you really think deleting an app changes anything?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "Do you think it erases what you've done? What you've been doing?" No, he said quickly, his eyes meeting mine. I know it doesn't. But I had to start somewhere. And I know it's not enough. I know I have to do more. But I don't know how, Lisa. I don't know how to fix this. His voice cracked on my name, and for the first time in weeks, I saw real unfiltered remorse in his eyes. Not the guilt of being caught, but the pain of a man who realized too late what he'd thrown away. I didn't answer him right away. I didn't know how. The anger in me was still raw, but beneath it was something else. A fragile thread of hope as dangerous as it was tempting. Could we rebuild from this? Did I even want to? You can't just fix this, Eric, I said finally. This isn't something you patch up with a few good intentions. What you did. I shook my head, unable to finish the thought. You broke us. I know, he said, his voice shaking. And I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it right if you'll let me. But if you can't, if you don't want to, I understand that too. His honesty took me off guard. He wasn't begging or making promises he couldn't keep. He was just laying it all out, raw and unvarnished. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I saw a glimmer of the man I fell in love with all those years ago. I don't know what I want, I admitted. I don't know if I can trust you again. Or if I even want to try. He nodded, his expression somber. I get that. I do. And I know it's not fair to ask for another chance. But I'm asking anyway. We sat in silence after that, the weight of his words settling over us. I didn't have an answer for him, not then. All I knew was that the road ahead was uncertain, and it terrified me. But for the first time in weeks, I also felt something else, a spark of possibility. Maybe it was foolish. Maybe it was naive. But it was there, fragile and flickering, waiting to see if we could turn the ashes of what we had into something new. The following weeks were some of the hardest of my life. Every conversation with Eric felt like walking a tightrope. The tension so thick between us that even the smallest misstep could send everything crashing down. We were polite to each other, careful in a way that felt unnatural, like strangers trying to navigate unfamiliar terrain. I could see he was trying. He deleted the app, stopped staying late at work, and even offered to go to counseling. But it didn't change the fact that I couldn't look at him without hearing the words he'd sent to those other women. I wasn't sure if I wanted to forgive him, or if I was even capable of it. Some nights I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of our marriage, searching for the signs I'd missed. Had I been blind? Or had he just been that good at hiding it? The uncertainty gnawed at me, making it hard to breathe, to think, to function. One night, about a month after the wine bar, I found myself in the spare bedroom, where I'd been sleeping since the confrontation. The distance felt necessary, like I needed the physical space to sort through the mess in my head. Eric had respected my decision without complaint, though I could see the pain in his eyes every time I closed the door between us. I was scrolling mindlessly through my phone when an idea struck me. A dangerous, impulsive idea. I reopened the dating app. Not under the fake profile I'd created as Clara, but as myself. I didn't know what I was looking for. Proof that he'd lied about deleting the app? Evidence that he was still sneaking around? Or maybe I was just trying to understand the world he'd been living in, the one he'd chosen over me. It didn't take long to find him. His profile was gone, just as he'd promised, but the app was full of men like him. Married, lonely, looking for something to fill the void in their lives. I clicked through the profiles, reading their carefully crafted bios, their not-so-subtle hints at what they were really after. It was like peeling back the curtain on a hidden world, one I'd never wanted to be part of, but now couldn't seem to look away from. A message popped up as I scrolled. You seem like someone I'd love to get to know better. The sender's profile was anonymous, his photo blurry and vague. I ignored it, but another message came through a moment later, then another. They were all the same. Men looking for an escape, a thrill, a connection. I shut the app and tossed my phone onto the nightstand, disgusted with myself for even going down that rabbit hole. But the damage was done. I couldn't stop thinking about how easy it had been for Eric to find someone else, how many opportunities there were for people like him to slip away unnoticed. The next morning I woke up to find Eric in the kitchen, cooking breakfast. The smell of bacon filled the air, and for a moment, it felt like any other morning before everything fell apart. He looked up when I walked in, his face lighting up with a hopeful smile that made my chest ache. Morning, he said, setting a plate of scrambled eggs on the counter. Thought I'd make something special today. I nodded, sitting down at the table. Thanks. We ate in silence, the clinking of utensils the only sound between us. I could feel him watching me, waiting for a sign, a signal, anything to show him where we stood. Do you ever think about why you did it? I asked suddenly, breaking the silence. He looked up, startled by the question. Every day, he said after a moment. I think about it every day. Do you even know? He sighed, setting his fork down. I don't know if there's a simple answer. Think I was scared. Of getting older, of feeling like my best years were behind me. And I was stupid enough to think that chasing something new would make me feel better. But it didn't. It just made everything worse. His honesty caught me off guard, and for a moment I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to lash out, to tell him how selfish and cruel he'd been. But another part of me, the part that still loved him despite everything, wanted to believe that he was telling the truth. Do you even know how much you hurt me? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. I do, he said, his voice breaking. And I hate myself for it. I hate that I hurt you, Lisa. I hate that I let you down. If I could take it all back, I would. Tears welled in my eyes and I blinked them away, refusing to let him see me cry. But you can't take it back, can you? You can't undo any of it. No, he said quietly. I can't. But I can try to be better. I can try to be the man you deserve. If you'll let me. The vulnerability in his voice was almost unbearable. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that the man sitting across from me was the real Eric, not the one who had betrayed me. But trust didn't come easily anymore, and I wasn't sure if it ever would. I don't know if I can, I said finally. I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again. He nodded, his expression somber. I understand. And whatever you decide, I'll accept it. But I'm not giving up on us, Lisa. Not until you tell me there's no hope left. His words stayed with me long after he left the kitchen. They echoed in my mind as I went about my day, as I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling. I didn't know what the future held for us. I didn't know if we could ever rebuild what we'd lost. But for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't quite hope, but it was close. Maybe that was enough to start. In the weeks that followed, Eric and I tiptoed around the fragile foundation of whatever this was, our attempt at rebuilding, or at least finding the truth of where we stood. Conversations that used to feel effortless were now careful, measured, as though we were afraid of saying the wrong thing and undoing all the progress we'd made. The house, once filled with laughter and the occasional argument about the little things, now echoed with a tentative silence that neither of us quite knew how to break. True to his word, Eric signed us up for couples therapy, though I could tell he was nervous when the day of our first session arrived. We sat in the waiting room, side by side but not touching, the distance between us palpable. When the therapist, a kind-looking woman in her late 40s named Dr. Heller, called us in, I wasn't sure what to expect. She started by asking us to talk about how we met. The question caught me off guard, and for a moment, I was transported back to that warm spring day in college when Eric had walked into the library, all charm and confidence, and struck up a conversation with me about a book I wasn't even reading. I glanced at him as I told the story, and for a fleeting moment, I saw the ghost of a smile on his face. It was a reminder of a simpler time, before careers and bills and the slow erosion of intimacy that had led us here. But as the session went on, the conversation turned to harder topics. The loneliness Eric had confessed to, the betrayal I still couldn't fully comprehend, and the gaping wound of mistrust that seemed impossible to heal. Dr. Heller asked difficult questions, ones that forced us to confront the cracks in our relationship, cracks that had been there long before Eric ever downloaded that app. Do you feel like your needs were being met in the marriage? She asked me at one point, and the question took me by surprise. I hesitated, unsure of how to answer. I thought they were, I said finally. I mean, I never really stopped to think about it. I was just doing what needed to be done. Taking care of the house, the kids, work, everything. I didn't have time to think about whether I was happy. And now, she pressed gently. I swallowed hard. Now I don't know. I thought I was happy before all of this, but maybe I was just comfortable. Maybe I stopped expecting more because I didn't think I could have it. The room fell silent, and I could feel Eric's eyes on me, though I didn't dare meet his gaze. For years I had buried my own feelings, pushing them aside in favor of keeping the peace, of making sure everyone else was okay. But now, with everything laid bare, I couldn't ignore them anymore. As we left the session that day, Eric reached for my hand. A tentative gesture, one that felt more like a question than an assumption. I hesitated for just a moment before letting him take it. His grip was warm, familiar, and for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like a betrayal to hold it. That night we talked. Really talked. Not just about the affair or the therapy session, but about everything. The little things that had gone unsaid for years, the moments we had let slip by unnoticed. It was painful and awkward at times, but it was also cathartic. Like we were finally peeling back the layers of a relationship we had both taken for granted. I started to see glimpses of the man I had fallen in love with all those years ago. The way he listened, really listened, without trying to justify or defend himself. The way he admitted his mistakes without making excuses. And the way he looked at me, as though he still saw something worth fighting for, even when I wasn't sure I did. But the doubt lingered. Trust, once broken, isn't something that can be pieced back together overnight. Every time he left the house, a part of me wondered if he was really going where he said he was. Every time his phone buzzed, I fought the urge to ask who was texting him. And every time he looked at me with that mixture of hope and regret, I wondered if I was making a mistake by staying. One evening, as I sat alone in the spare bedroom, I found myself scrolling through old photos on my phone. There we were, smiling on our honeymoon in Hawaii, our faces tanned and carefree. There was the picture of Eric holding our newborn son for the first time, his eyes filled with awe and love. And then there was the candid shot of us at a friend's wedding, laughing so hard we were crying. I stared at that last photo for a long time, tears blurring my vision. I missed that version of us, the one that didn't have secrets or lies between them, the one that believed in forever without question. The sound of a knock at the door pulled me from my thoughts. Eric stood in the doorway, his expression uncertain. "Can I come in?" he asked softly. I nodded and he stepped inside, sitting down on the edge of the bed. For a moment neither of us spoke. "I know it's not easy," he said finally. "And I know I have no right to ask this, but do you think we can ever get back to what we were?" I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time I saw not just the man who had betrayed me but the man who was trying, truly trying, to make things right. "I don't know if we can ever go back," I said honestly. "But maybe we can figure out something new. Something better." His eyes searched mine, and for the first time in months, I saw a glimmer of hope in them. He nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "I'll do whatever it takes, Lisa. I promise." It wasn't a perfect moment, and it didn't magically erase the pain or the doubt, but it was a start, a small tentative step towards something that felt like healing. And for now that was enough. The days turned into weeks, and the fragile truce between us began to take shape into something more tangible. Therapy sessions became a regular part of our lives, a space where we could lay bare our feelings without fear of immediate judgment. At first it felt unnatural, even painful, to share so openly in front of a stranger. But as the sessions went on, I began to see the value in it. Dr. Heller didn't take sides, didn't let either of us hide behind our defenses. She forced us to confront the uncomfortable truths about ourselves, about our marriage, and about what we wanted moving forward. Eric's honesty, while difficult to hear, became a cornerstone of these sessions. He admitted to the loneliness he'd felt, to the insecurity that had driven him to seek validation in the most destructive way possible. But he also owned his choices, never once trying to shift the blame onto me or anyone else. That, more than anything, began to soften the walls I'd built around myself. It didn't erase the hurt, but it made me feel like he was truly fighting for us, not just out of guilt but because he still loved me. At home, the changes were slow but noticeable. Eric started to be more present, not just physically but emotionally. He put away his phone during dinner, asked about my day, and actually listened to my answers. It was jarring at first, this sudden attentiveness from a man who had spent years retreating into his own world. Part of me was suspicious, wondering if it was just an act to win me back. But as the days turned into weeks, his efforts didn't waver, and I began to believe that maybe, just maybe, he was sincere. One evening we found ourselves sitting on the back porch, a bottle of wine between us. The sun had set, and the air was cool, the kind of crisp autumn evening that begged for blankets and quiet conversations. We hadn't planned to sit out there, it just sort of happened. I had gone outside to clear my head, and Eric had followed, hesitant but determined not to let me drift too far from him. We sat in silence for a while, the only sound the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, though. It felt peaceful, like we were finally starting to find our rhythm again. I was thinking about that camping trip we took to the Smoky Mountains, Eric said suddenly, his voice soft but clear in the stillness. Do you remember? The one where it rained the whole weekend. I couldn't help but smile at the memory. Of course I remember. We were soaked to the bone, and you insisted on trying to start a fire anyway. And you laughed at me the whole time, he said, his lips curling into a grin. But then when I finally got it going, you made me mesmerize and told me I was a genius. You were so proud of yourself, I said, shaking my head. Even though we were miserable and freezing. But we were together, he said, his tone shifting to something more serious. Even then, in the worst conditions, we were happy. I miss that, Lisa. I miss us. His words hung in the air, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. It was true, we had been happy then, even in the middle of a downpour with mud in our boots. But the years since had worn us down, chipped away at that carefree version of ourselves until all that was left were two people trying to figure out if they could still fit together. I miss it too, I admitted finally. But I don't know if we can ever get back to that. Too much has happened. I know, he said quietly. But I'm willing to try. Even if it takes years, even if we never get back to exactly what we had, I want to try. You're worth that to me. His sincerity was almost too much to bear. I felt tears welling up and I turned away, not wanting him to see how vulnerable I was in that moment. But he reached out, his hand resting gently on mine, grounding me. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, he said. And I know I can't undo the damage I've done. But I want you to know that I'm not going anywhere. I'll be here however long it takes. We sat there for what felt like hours, the wine forgotten, our hands entwined. It wasn't a resolution, not by any stretch, but it was something. A promise to keep trying, to keep showing up, even when it was hard. As the weeks turned into months, we began to rebuild in small, almost imperceptible ways. We started having dinner together every night, something we hadn't done consistently in years. We went for walks in the evenings, talking about everything and nothing, rediscovering the joy of each other's company. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments of tension, of doubt, of hurt, but we faced them together one step at a time. Therapy continued to be a cornerstone of our progress. Dr. Heller encouraged us to focus not just on the pain but on what had brought us together in the first place. She asked us to remember the good moments, to find ways to recreate them in the present. It felt strange at first, almost forced, but slowly it started to feel natural. We found ourselves laughing more, sharing jokes and stories the way we used to. It was like rediscovering an old cherished book, one you hadn't opened in years but still knew by heart. There were setbacks, of course. Trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight. There were moments when I caught myself second-guessing his every move, when the doubt crept back in like an unwelcome guest. But Eric didn't falter. He met every moment of suspicion with patience, every question with honesty. It didn't erase the past, but it showed me that he was willing to do the work, no matter how long it took. One night, as we lay in bed together for the first time in months, I turned to him, my heart pounding in my chest. Do you think we'll ever be okay again? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and regret. I think we already are, he said softly. We're not perfect and we never will be. But we're here. We're trying. And that's more than I could have hoped for. I didn't respond right away, letting his words sink in. He was right, things weren't perfect and they probably never would be. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were moving forward, like the pieces of our shattered lives were slowly coming back together. It wasn't the life we'd had before, but maybe it didn't need to be. Maybe it could be something new, something better. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to believe that we might just make it. As the months went by, the fragile thread of connection between Eric and me grew stronger, though it wasn't without its struggles. Healing, I realized, was not a straight line. Some days I felt like we were making real progress, sharing laughter over morning coffee, or stealing quiet moments together during a walk. Other days, the doubts would creep back in like a shadow, whispering questions that I didn't know how to silence. Was he still thinking about those other women? Could I truly believe in his promises? Was I fooling myself by staying? Despite the ups and downs, I started to notice changes in both of us. Eric was no longer the distant, preoccupied man he had been for so long. He was more present, more attentive. He asked about my day, remembered the little things I mentioned, and seemed genuinely interested in my thoughts and feelings. It felt strange at first, almost like being courted by a stranger. But over time I began to realize that it wasn't a stranger at all. It was the man I had married, the man I thought I'd lost. For my part, I started to let go of some of the bitterness I'd been carrying. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when the anger flared up unexpectedly, sharp and hot, catching me off guard. But each time I reminded myself of why I was still here, because despite everything I wanted to give us a chance. Not for the life we used to have, but for the one we might still build together. One evening, Eric came home from work with a small box in his hands. His expression was nervous, almost boyish, as he handed it to me. "I saw this today, and it made me think of you," he said, his voice hesitant. I opened the box to find a delicate silver bracelet, simple yet elegant, with a small charm shaped like a tree. I traced the charm with my fingers, feeling a lump rise in my throat. "It's beautiful," I said softly, looking up at him. He sat down beside me, his gaze earnest. "The tree, it reminded me of us. How we've been through so much, but we're still standing. Still growing." His words struck a chord deep within me, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe we really could survive this. Maybe, like the tree, our roots were strong enough to weather the storm. That night, as I lay in bed, I found myself thinking about the little moments that had brought us here. Not just the pain and betrayal, but the acts of love and kindness that had slowly started to rebuild the foundation of our marriage. It wasn't just the big gestures like the bracelet or the therapy sessions. It was the way he left notes for me on the fridge, reminding me to take care of myself. It was the way he insisted on doing the dishes every night, even though he hated it because he knew I was exhausted. It was the way he looked at me now, not with guilt or fear, but with a quiet determination that told me he wasn't giving up. As the weeks turned into months, we started to create new traditions, new memories that didn't carry the weight of the past. We began taking cooking classes together on Saturday mornings, laughing at our failed attempts to make pasta from scratch. We started having movie nights again, something we hadn't done since our early years of marriage. It felt good to reconnect, to find joy in each other's company again. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were still moments when the past reared its ugly head. Moments when I found myself questioning whether I could ever truly trust him again. One such moment came late one night, when I woke up to find his side of the bed empty. Panic gripped me as I got up, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. I found him in the kitchen, sitting at the table with his head in his hands. He looked up when I walked in, his expression weary. "Couldn't sleep?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. He shook his head. "Just thinking." I sat down across from him, waiting for him to speak. Finally, he looked at me, his eyes filled with a vulnerability that caught me off guard. "I know I've given you every reason not to trust me," he said. "And I know it's going to take a long time to earn that trust back. But I need you to know that I'm trying, Lisa. I'm trying every day to be better. For you, for us." His words hit me harder than I expected, and I felt my resolve soften. I reached across the table, taking his hand in mine. "I know you are," I said. "And I'm trying too. But it's going to take time. For both of us." He nodded, squeezing my hand gently. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. In that moment, I realized that healing wasn't about erasing the past or pretending it hadn't happened. It was about choosing every day to move forward together, even when it was hard. As the months turned into a year, I began to see glimpses of what our future might look like. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of doubt, still scars that hadn't fully healed, but it was real. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were both fighting for the same thing. A chance to build something stronger, something better. Looking back, I knew we would never be the same as we once were. But maybe that wasn't such a bad thing. Maybe the cracks in our marriage had allowed us to grow in ways we never would have otherwise. And maybe, just maybe, those cracks were what made us stronger. We were still standing, still growing, and for now that was enough. As time passed, the scars of betrayal began to feel less raw. They didn't disappear. Scars never do. But they became part of the landscape of our marriage, a quiet reminder of the pain we'd endured and the resilience it had taken to survive. I still thought about it sometimes, usually late at night when my mind wandered to places it shouldn't. But those moments came less frequently, and when they did, they no longer consumed me the way they once had. Eric continued to work tirelessly to prove his commitment, not just to me but to himself. I could see the effort in everything he did, from the way he spoke to me with intention, to the way he went out of his way to make me feel valued. He started small, doing things he knew I appreciated but had often taken for granted in the past. Making coffee in the morning, picking up my favorite snacks at the store, leaving little notes in places where he knew I'd find them. They were simple gestures, but they spoke volumes. More than that, Eric seemed to have shifted his entire perspective on life. He started spending more time with the kids, showing up to their soccer games and dance recitals with a newfound enthusiasm. I watched him cheer from the sidelines, his face lighting up in a way I hadn't seen in years. It was as if he'd rediscovered the joy of being present, of truly living in the moment. For my part, I tried to let myself trust him again. It wasn't easy, and I stumbled more times than I cared to admit. There were days when the memories of his betrayal resurfaced with a vengeance, clouding everything else. But each time I reminded myself of the progress we'd made, of the man he was trying so hard to be. It wasn't blind forgiveness. It was a conscious choice to believe in the possibility of something better. One evening after the kids had gone to bed, Eric and I found ourselves sitting on the couch together, a rare moment of quiet in the chaos of daily life. He handed me a glass of wine, and we sat in comfortable silence for a while, the soft hum of the dishwasher the only sound in the room. "You know," he said eventually, his voice thoughtful, "I think about that night at the wine bar a lot, about how close I came to losing everything." I turned to look at him, surprised by the confession. It wasn't like Eric to dwell on the past. He'd always been someone who preferred to move forward, to focus on what was next. "What do you think about?" I asked, my tone curious rather than accusatory. He hesitated, swirling the wine in his glass. "I think about how much I hurt you, how blind I was to what I had, and how grateful I am that you gave me another chance." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I didn't respond right away, letting the weight of his honesty settle between us. Finally, I reached for his hand, lacing my fingers with his. "I didn't do it for you," I said quietly. "I did it for us, because I knew deep down that there was still something worth fighting for." He squeezed my hand, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "There is," he said, "and I'll never stop fighting for it." In that moment, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't the naive certainty of our early years, when I believed love alone was enough to sustain a marriage. It was something deeper, something harder one. It was the knowledge that we had faced the worst and come out the other side, bruised but not broken. As the months turned into years, our lives slowly found a new rhythm. The pain of the past never completely disappeared, but it no longer defined us. We built new memories to replace the ones that had been tainted, creating a life that felt richer and more meaningful than the one we'd had before. We traveled more, something we'd always talked about but never prioritized. There were weekend trips to nearby towns, exploring hidden gems we'd never taken the time to visit. There was a week in the mountains where we hiked trails and sat by the fire, talking late into the night. And then there was the trip to Italy, a dream we'd both shared since the early days of our marriage. We wandered through cobblestone streets, marveled at ancient ruins, and ate pasta in tiny cafes, rediscovering not just the world but each other. Back home, our family life flourished. The kids seemed to sense the change in us, the way we worked together as a team rather than two people moving in parallel. They saw us laughing more, touching more, leaning into each other in ways we hadn't for years. One afternoon, while we were all sitting in the backyard, our youngest turned to me with a curious expression. "Mom," she said, her voice full of innocence, "are you and Dad best friends?" The question caught me off guard, and I glanced at Eric, who was smiling softly. "Yeah," I said after a moment. "We are." It wasn't a perfect answer, and it didn't capture the full complexity of our relationship, but it was true in its own way. We had found our way back to each other, not just as husband and wife, but as partners, allies, and yes, friends. Looking back, I realized that the affair, though devastating, had forced us to confront the cracks in our marriage that we'd ignored for too long. It had brought us to the brink, but it had also given us the chance to rebuild something stronger. It wasn't the path I would have chosen, but it was the one we'd walked together, and in the end it had brought us here. Here, to a life that wasn't perfect but was undeniably ours. A life where love wasn't just a feeling but a choice we made every day, in big ways and small. A life where we had learned, through pain and perseverance, what it truly meant to be partners. And for that I was grateful.